Dr. James C. Burt was, by all appearances, a model physician and a pillar of the community in Dayton, Ohio. He was a senior obstetrician and gynecologist at the respected St. Elizabeth's Medical Center, a devout churchgoer, and a family man. For over 2 decades, thousands of women placed their trust in him, believing he was a caring professional who would guide them through childbirth, treat their illnesses, and protect their most intimate health. They walked into his operating room for routine procedures, hysterectomies, bladder repairs, even C-sections, believing they were in safe hands. They were wrong. Dr. Burt wasn't just treating his patients. He was using them as living canvases for his grotesque, unauthorized surgical experiments. Dr. Burt harbored a secret, deeply misogynistic philosophy, which he detailed in a self-published book titled Surgery of Love. In its pages, he laid out his insane theory that the female anatomy was inherently flawed and required surgical correction to be sexually optimal for men. He believed it was his duty as a doctor to improve his patients, whether they asked for it or not. He called his work love surgery, and he performed these alterations on hundreds of his patients without their knowledge or consent. While a woman was unconscious on his operating table for a legitimate medical reason, Burt would go to work. He would reposition the clitoris, drastically tighten the vaginal opening, and perform other radical modifications, all designed to fit his personal blueprint of the perfect woman. He chillingly referred to this mutilation as giving his patients his mark of excellence. Women would wake up from surgery with no idea that while their medical issue had been fixed, their bodies had been permanently and horrifically altered. For years, the victims suffered in silence. They were left with chronic, debilitating pain, severe nerve damage, a total loss of sexual sensation, and an anatomy so changed that intercourse became impossible. Many were too ashamed to speak out, while others who sought help were dismissed by other doctors, who couldn't believe a colleague would do such a thing. The dam of silence finally broke thanks to one courageous patient, Janet Phillips. After years of suffering, she found a doctor who listened, examined her, and confirmed the horrifying truth: she had been surgically butchered. Phillips went public with her story, and it opened the floodgates. Hundreds of other women in the Dayton area suddenly realized they were not alone. They recognized their own stories of inexplicable pain and betrayal in Phillips's account. They formed a support group, calling themselves Burt's Victims, and together, they decided to fight back. What followed was one of the largest medical malpractice legal battles in Ohio's history, with over 500 women filing lawsuits against Dr. Burt and St. Elizabeth's Medical Center. The legal proceedings revealed an even more disturbing truth. The hospital knew. Evidence showed that administrators and fellow doctors had been aware of Burt's bizarre theories and had received complaints about him for years, yet did nothing. They chose to protect their star surgeon and the revenue he generated over the safety of their patients. In a turn of events that sparked outrage, Dr. Burt was never criminally charged. Because his actions took place in a surgical setting, they were framed as medical malpractice, not as the sexual assault and battery they truly were. The battle moved from the courtroom to the Ohio State Medical Board in 1988. During the hearings, Burt was arrogant and completely unrepentant. He testified that he was a misunderstood pioneer and that his victims should be grateful for the gift he had given them. In a chilling quote that revealed his true mindset, he stated, "The male is the dominant partner in the sexual union. He wants a passive, compliant, and content female." On January 27, 1989, the medical board permanently revoked James Burt's license to practice medicine in the state of Ohio, finding him guilty of gross malpractice and of performing unnecessary and experimental procedures. Eventually, St. Elizabeth's Medical Center settled with the victims, paying out over $23 million in damages. Dr. James Burt never spent a single day in prison for his crimes. He simply surrendered his medical license and retired. He died in 2012 at the age of 91, a free man. His legacy is the permanent physical and psychological trauma inflicted on hundreds of women who trusted him. He was a sadist disguised as a surgeon, a man whose insanity was not a wild frenzy, but a calm, methodical, decades-long campaign of mutilation, carried out one unsuspecting patient at a time. Dr. Walter Freeman was not a back-alley quack. Born in 1895 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, he was the son of a successful doctor and the grandson of a famous surgeon. He was educated at Yale and the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, eventually becoming the first physician in Washington, D.C. to specialize in neurology. By all accounts, he was a respected, ambitious man at the forefront of a desperate field. In the 1930s and 40s, mental asylums were brutal, and doctors had few tools beyond restraints and sedation. Freeman saw himself as a pioneer destined to solve this crisis. His first foray into psychosurgery was with a colleague, Dr. James Watts. Together, they performed the prefrontal lobotomy, a procedure that involved drilling holes into the sides of a patient's skull and inserting a blade to sever neural connections. The results were mixed, but the procedure was time-consuming, expensive, and required a sterile operating room and a neurosurgeon. For Freeman, a man with a colossal ego and a messianic vision, this wasn't enough. He believed lobotomies should be accessible to everyone, and he envisioned a method that was faster, cheaper, and could be performed by him alone. He found his twisted inspiration in the most mundane of places. He had observed a doctor use a mallet and a metal pick to tap above a patient's eye to check their sinuses. A thought sparked in Freeman's mind. What if he could reach the brain through the thin bone of the eye socket? In 1946, without his partner's approval, he put his theory into practice. His first patient was a 29-year-old housewife named Sally Ellen Ionesco, who was suffering from severe depression. Freeman instructed her to undergo electroshock therapy to render her unconscious. Then he took a long, sharp instrument, a leucotome, which was essentially a customized ice pick, lined it up with her tear duct, and with a surgical mallet, hammered it through the bone of her eye socket until it entered her brain. He then brutally swished the instrument back and forth, severing the fibers of her frontal lobe. He repeated the process on the other side. The entire procedure took only a few minutes. When she woke up, Freeman declared her cured. This was the birth of the transorbital lobotomy, and for Freeman, it was a revelation. He now had a weapon he could wield with terrifying efficiency. He broke off his partnership with the horrified Dr. Watts and began a one-man crusade. He created a custom van he nicknamed the Lobotomobile and embarked on a cross-country tour, bringing his procedure to state hospitals far and wide. He became a performer, a medical evangelist with a flair for the dramatic. Eyewitnesses described him as a showman, treating the operating theater like a stage. He would lecture to crowds of doctors and nurses while plunging his ice pick into a patient's brain. In one infamous demonstration, he attempted to perform 2 lobotomies at once, hammering a pick into each patient's eye with each hand, only to have one of the instruments snap off deep in the patient's head. His recklessness was matched only by his complete disregard for sterile procedure. He rarely wore gloves, using the same uncleaned instruments on patient after patient. He boasted of his record, once performing 25 lobotomies in a single day, but his cures were a nightmare. While some patients became more docile, thousands were left emotionally blunted, intellectually disabled, or in a vegetative state. His most famous failure was Rosemary Kennedy, the 23-year-old sister of future President John F. Kennedy. Her father subjected her to the procedure to correct her mood swings. Freeman's ice pick left her with the mental capacity of a 2-year-old, unable to walk or speak intelligibly for the rest of her life. Another victim, Howard Dully, was lobotomized at just 12 years old at his stepmother's request. He later described the procedure as a shameful, terrible thing, a medical atrocity that stole his life before it began. The medical community began to turn on Freeman as his trail of human wreckage grew. His downfall was accelerated by the introduction of thorazine in the 1950s, the first effective antipsychotic drug, which offered a humane alternative to his butchery. But Freeman refused to stop. His career finally ended in February 1967, when he performed his third lobotomy on a patient named Helen Mortensen. This time, the procedure killed her. The hospital immediately banned him from performing any more surgery. Across his career, Dr. Walter Freeman performed over 3,400 lobotomies, ending the lives of nearly 500 people and incapacitating countless more. He was never charged with a crime for his actions. He died of cancer in 1972, unapologetic to the end. He remains a terrifying figure in medical history, a man whose ambition and monumental ego were far more deranged and dangerous than any illness he ever claimed to cure. Dr. Isaac Hirschkopf was the picture of success. Operating out of a lavish office on New York's Upper East Side, he was a psychiatrist to the stars, with a client list that reportedly included names like Gwyneth Paltrow and Courtney Love. He was charismatic, confident, and radiated an aura of absolute authority. In 1981, a man named Marty Markowitz walked into that office. Marty was the opposite of Ike's glamorous clientele. He was a gentle, unassuming man in his late 30s, recently orphaned and overwhelmed by the responsibility of running his family's successful fabric company. Plagued by anxiety and a manipulative ex-girlfriend, Marty was simply looking for help. What he found was a predator who would not just treat him, but consume his entire existence for the next 3 decades. The manipulation began subtly. Dr. Hirschkopf, or Ike, as he insisted Marty call him, quickly identified Marty's insecurities and his deep-seated fear of disappointing people. He diagnosed Marty's problems as stemming from one source: his family. Ike convinced Marty that his sister Phyllis was a toxic influence who was trying to steal his inheritance. He framed himself as Marty's sole protector, the only person who truly had his best interests at heart. His prescription was simple and absolute. Marty had to cut his sister and everyone else from his old life out completely. Under Ike's direction, Marty fired his own sister from the family company and ceased all communication. Within 2 years, Marty was completely isolated, with Izzy as his only confidant, advisor, and friend. With Marty isolated, Izzy began the takeover. The professional boundary didn't just blur, it was annihilated. Ike started by having Marty rewrite his will, instructing him to leave a large portion of his estate to a new foundation. The foundation's president and vice president were, of course, E.C. Hirschkopf and his wife. Next, Ike set his sights on Marty's money. He convinced Marty to open a Swiss bank account and grant him power of attorney. Over $2 million of Marty's money was now under Ike's direct control. But the ultimate prize was Marty's magnificent vacation home in the Hamptons. Ike persuaded Marty that the property was a burden and that he should transfer it into his wife's name. When that failed, he simply moved his own family in. He threw lavish, star-studded parties, paid for by Marty, where celebrities and socialites would mingle. At these events, Ike introduced Marty not as the owner of the house, but as his handyman. While Ike and his family slept in the master bedroom, Marty was relegated to the guest quarters. He was ordered to perform manual labor, serving drinks, grilling food, and meticulously maintaining a koi pond Ike had installed. For 27 years, Marty Markowitz was a servant in his own home, a prisoner of a psychological cage built by the very man he paid to set him free. The spell finally broke in 2010. After nearly 30 years under Ike's control, Marty developed a hernia and required surgery. In his moment of physical vulnerability, the man who controlled his every move, who claimed to be his protector, didn't bother to visit or even call. That small act of neglect was a crack in the facade, allowing Marty to see the truth for the first time. Ike didn't care about him at all. Hesitantly, he began to think for himself, and he eventually re-established contact with his sister, Phyllis. The reunion was the final key to unlocking his psychological prison. With his family's support, Marty began the long process of reclaiming his life. In 2012, he filed a formal complaint with the New York State Department of Health. The case languished for years until it was discovered by journalist Joe Nocera, who turned Marty's unbelievable story into the hit podcast, The Shrink Next Door, bringing international attention and immense pressure onto the medical board. Finally, in April 2021, the verdict came down. The New York Department of Health found Dr. Isaac Hirschkopf guilty of 16 charges of professional misconduct, including gross negligence, undue influence, moral unfitness, and fraud. The board's ruling was brutal, stating that he had committed a profound and unforgivable betrayal, and that his behavior was appallingly manipulative and exploitative. They ordered the complete and irrevocable revocation of his license to practice medicine. As of August 2025, Isaac Hirschkopf is no longer a doctor. He is a public disgrace, forced to pay Marty a settlement and stripped of the career he used as a weapon. Marty Markowitz, now in his 80s, has full control of his house, his company, and his life. He is reconciled with his sister and finally found the freedom he sought all those years ago. A. Kirschkopf never built a physical prison, but for 3 decades, he proved that the most insane therapist doesn't need walls to hold a patient captive. He just needs to convince them the prison is a home. To the nearly 3,000 residents of Hyde, a quiet market town in Greater Manchester, England, Dr. Harold Shipman was a pillar of the community. He made house calls, remembered his patients' names, and was particularly attentive to the elderly women who made up a large portion of his practice. They adored him. They invited him into their homes, trusted him with their lives, and saw his reassuring presence as a comfort in their old age. They had no idea that behind his gentle smile was a cold, calculating predator who was using his medical bag as a serial killer's toolkit. For over 2 decades, Dr. Shipman ran his practice not as a place of healing, but as his own private hunting ground. His method of murder was chillingly simple and brutally effective. He would arrange a house call, usually to one of his elderly female patients who lived alone. Under the guise of a routine checkup or administering pain relief, he would inject his victim with a fatal dose of diamorphine, pure, medical-grade heroin. The drug would quickly shut down their respiratory system, causing a quiet, peaceful-looking death that was easily mistaken for old age or natural causes. Immediately after the murder, Shipman would go to his computer and begin his cover-up. He would meticulously alter the patient's digital medical records, fabricating a history of symptoms and ailments that made their sudden death seem plausible. A healthy 75-year-old woman would suddenly have a documented history of severe chest pains and heart trouble created by Shipman just moments after he had killed her. As the attending physician, he would often be the one to officially certify the death, allowing him to control the entire narrative and ensure that no suspicious coroner would ever order an autopsy. For years, Shipman operated with impunity, his crimes hidden in plain sight. An undertaker in Hyde later noted that Dr. Shipman's patients seemed to die at an unusually high rate, often during the day, fully clothed and sitting upright in their chairs as if they'd simply drifted off. But he dismissed it as a statistical anomaly. The system was built on trusting doctors, and no one could conceive that a man like Shipman was a monster. His arrogance, however, would be his undoing. The turning point came in June 1998, with the death of Kathleen Grundy, an active and wealthy 81-year-old who had once been the town's mayoress. Shipman was the last person to see her alive. After her death, he produced a new will, supposedly typed by Mrs. Grundy herself, which left her entire estate, worth nearly £400,000 to him. The document was riddled with errors and featured a clumsy, forged signature. Shipman's explanation was that the lonely old woman wanted to thank him for his years of care. He had made a fatal miscalculation. Mrs. Grundy's daughter, Angela Woodruff, was a lawyer. She knew her mother was a sharp and meticulous woman who would never create such a sloppy document, and she certainly would never cut her own family out of her will. Woodruff immediately went to the police, convinced that Dr. Shipman had murdered her mother. The investigation began. Kathleen Grundy's body was exhumed, and the autopsy revealed the terrifying truth. She had died from a massive overdose of diamorphine. Police seized Shipman's computer, and on it, they found a ghost history of fabricated illnesses. They had caught him. The investigation quickly widened as police realized the horrifying scope of his crimes. They began to identify a clear pattern and exhumed more bodies. One by one, the results came back the same: lethal doses of diamorphine. On January 31, 2000, after a 6-week trial where he displayed nothing but arrogant contempt, a jury found Harold Shipman guilty on 15 sample counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. The judge sentenced him to 15 consecutive life sentences, telling him directly, "You have finally been brought to justice for your wicked, evil crimes." But the horror was far from over. The British government launched the Shipman Inquiry, a massive 2-year investigation to determine the true number of his victims. The final report was a bombshell. The inquiry concluded that Dr. Harold Shipman had murdered at least 218 of his patients, though the total was likely closer to 250. His killing spree had started as early as 1975, The motive remains a subject of debate. While he forged one will, his primary drive didn't appear to be financial. Experts believe he suffered from a pathological God complex, deriving pleasure and a sense of power from deciding who lived and who died. On January 13, 2004, the day before his 58th birthday, Harold Shipman used a bedsheet to hang himself in his cell at Wakefield Prison. He took his secrets with him, leaving hundreds of families to grapple with the knowledge that their loved ones' final moments were spent with the man who was calmly and quietly murdering them. He shattered the sacred trust between doctor and patient on an unprecedented scale, earning his title as the most prolific serial killer in British history. In the small, tight-knit farming community of Kipling, Saskatchewan, Canada, Dr. John Schneeberger was more than just a family physician. He was a town hero. Having immigrated from South Africa with his wife, who was also a doctor, Schneeberger was seen as a charming, intelligent, and deeply caring man. His patients trusted him completely. When a 24-year-old mother of 5, whose identity is protected by a publication ban, was brought to the Kipling Hospital in 1992 after suffering a blackout spell, she believed she was in the safest possible hands when Dr. Schneeberger was assigned as the physician on call. Dr. Schneeberger administered a powerful sedative to the woman. Sometime later, she began to regain consciousness, trapped in a horrifying state of paralysis. She was unable to move or speak, but she was aware of her surroundings as she was brutally sexually assaulted. She clearly identified her attacker. It was the town's beloved Dr. Schneeberger. When she reported the crime, the town was thrown into a state of disbelief. The community rallied around their doctor, unable to accept that he could be capable of such a monstrous act. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police launched an investigation. They collected the crucial evidence, semen samples left by the attacker. To confirm their suspect, they asked Dr. Schneeberger for a blood sample to compare DNA. Appearing calm and cooperative, Schneeberger willingly provided it. The results came back and shocked everyone. The DNA in Dr. Schneeberger's blood did not match the DNA from the crime scene. He was cleared. The case was dropped, and his victim was cruelly ostracized, branded a liar who had tried to destroy the life of a good man. For 5 years, Schneeberger was a vindicated hero, and his victim lived in a private hell. But the darkness surfaced again. In 1997, Schneeberger began drugging and sexually assaulting his own 13-year-old stepdaughter. The abuse continued until the girl confided in her mother, Schneeberger's wife. Though initially defensive of her husband, his wife's suspicion grew, and she went to the police. Once again, investigators focused on Schneeberger. Once again, they had DNA evidence from the crime. And once again, Schneeberger calmly provided a blood sample for comparison. The results were the same. His blood DNA did not match the crime scene DNA. For investigators, this was no longer a coincidence. It was an impossibility. 2 separate victims, years apart, both accusing the same man, and in both cases, the DNA evidence miraculously cleared him. They knew he had to be cheating the test, but they had no idea how. They launched a new, more aggressive investigation led by a determined RCMP sergeant named Al Sarna. Sarna was convinced Schneeberger wasn't tampering with the lab results. He was tampering with his own body. In March of 1999, police executed a warrant to get new samples from Schneeberger. But this time they wouldn't be fooled. They collected blood, saliva, and, crucially, hair follicles pulled directly from his scalp. During the blood draw, an officer noticed faint scarring on Schneeberger's left arm, near where the needle was inserted. The samples were sent to the lab, and the results finally blew the case wide open. The DNA from his hair and saliva was a perfect match to the DNA from both the 1992 assault and the attacks on his stepdaughter. The DNA from his blood sample, however, was from a completely different, unidentified person. The insane, audacious truth was finally revealed. Dr. John Schneeberger, using his advanced medical knowledge, had performed surgery on himself. He had implanted a 4-inch-long Penrose drain, a soft, flexible latex tube, deep inside the muscle of his left arm. He had filled this tube with the blood of a male colleague, along with anticoagulants, to keep it from clotting. For 7 years, he had carried another man's DNA inside his own body. Whenever police required a blood sample, he would confidently offer his left arm, knowing he was providing them with a perfect, scientifically backed alibi. Faced with the undeniable match from his hair follicles, Schneeberger's intricate web of deceit collapsed. In November 1999, he was convicted for the 1992 sexual assault and was later found guilty of the prolonged abuse of his stepdaughter. He was sentenced to 6 years in a federal prison. As of August 2025, the aftermath of his bizarre crimes continues. After being released on parole in 2004, he was rearrested for violations and ultimately served his full sentence. He was deported back to his native South Africa in 2015. His case forced law enforcement agencies around the world to rethink how they collect DNA evidence. Dr. Schneeberger's insanity wasn't just in his predatory crimes, but in the brilliant, meticulous, and surgically implanted lie he created to conceal them. He was a man who didn't just violate his patients, he attempted to violate the very foundations of scientific truth. To the outside world, Dr. Martin McNeil had it all. He was a successful physician and the medical director of the Utah State Developmental Center, a man who also held a law degree. He was a prominent figure in his Mormon community in Pleasant Grove, Utah, and the patriarch of a large, beautiful family with his wife of nearly 30 years, Michelle, a former beauty queen. They had 8 children, lived in a sprawling, gated home, and projected an image of perfect, wholesome prosperity. But behind the closed doors of that perfect home, Martin McNeil was living a lie. And that lie was about to curdle into a murder plot so cold and calculated it would tear his family apart. The facade of the happy family began to crumble as Martin descended into a web of deceit. He was deeply entangled in a long-term affair with a woman named Gyps Willis, a nursing student years younger than him. He wasn't just cheating, he was building a second life, setting Gyps up with an apartment, a car, and even helping her forge a new identity. At home, he became increasingly cruel and controlling towards Michelle. The final straw came when Michelle discovered the affair. She was heartbroken but, guided by her faith, was determined to fight for her marriage. For Martin McNeil, this was a disaster. His wife was no longer a partner. She was an obstacle, a witness who could destroy his carefully constructed world. His solution was diabolical. He began to relentlessly pressure Michelle to get a cosmetic facelift. He framed it as a gift, something to make her feel youthful and confident again. In reality, he was setting the stage. He knew the recovery from such a surgery would require a cocktail of powerful prescription painkillers and sedatives, rendering his wife weak, vulnerable, and completely dependent on him. He personally consulted with the plastic surgeon, using his medical authority to request a specific, dangerous combination of drugs for Michelle's post-operative care: Valium, Ambien, Percocet, and Phenergan. The surgeon later testified he felt uneasy, but ultimately deferred to the request of a fellow physician. On April 11, 2007, just 8 days after her surgery, 50-year-old Michelle McNeil was found dead. It was her 6-year-old daughter who discovered her, submerged and unresponsive in the family bathtub. Martin McNeil's 911 call was a bizarre, hysterical performance. He shouted at the operator, gave conflicting information, and at one point hung up. When paramedics arrived, the scene felt wrong. Martin claimed he had pulled his wife from the tub and attempted CPR, yet her body was curiously dry. Despite the strange circumstances, the medical examiner ruled Michelle's death an accident, caused by cardiovascular disease, complicated by the medications in her system. Dr. McNeil had, for the moment, committed the perfect murder, but he underestimated his own children. His adult daughters, particularly Alexis, who was in medical school herself, were immediately suspicious. Their father's grief seemed theatrical and hollow. The ultimate red flag came just over a week after their mother's funeral. Martin announced he had hired a new live-in nanny to help care for the younger children. The nanny was his mistress, Gyps Willis. Fueled by grief and a growing certainty of foul play, Alexis and her sisters launched their own investigation. They obtained their mother's medical records and autopsy report. Alexis, using her medical training, recognized that the specific cocktail of drugs her father had insisted on was a recipe for incapacitation and respiratory failure. They realized his plan had been deliberate. Get her cosmetic surgery, load her up with drugs he personally requested, and then drown her when she was too sedated to fight back. The daughters began a relentless crusade, begging investigators to reopen the case and refusing to let their father get away with murder. Their efforts paid off. The investigation was reopened, and detectives began to uncover the depth of Martin's deceit. They discovered he was a lifelong con artist who had even faked his own university transcripts to get into medical school. A former mistress came forward, testifying that Martin had once chillingly described to her the perfect way to kill someone using drugs that would be untraceable. The most damning evidence came from inmates who had been incarcerated with McNeil on separate federal fraud charges. They testified that Martin had confessed everything, bragging that he drugged Michelle, helped her into the tub, and then held her head underwater until she stopped breathing. In October 2013, the trial began, captivating the nation. The prosecution laid out the entire sinister plot for the jury. On November 9, 2013, Martin McNeil was found guilty of first-degree murder and obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to prison for a term of 17 years to life. He was later convicted in a separate trial for the sexual abuse of his daughter Alexis, which had occurred years earlier. On April 9, 2017, almost 10 years to the day after he murdered his wife, 61-year-old Martin McNeil was found dead in the yard of the Utah State Prison. He had taken his own life. As of August 2025, his case serves as a horrifying example of domestic evil disguised by a doctor's lab coat. His insanity was one of pure narcissism, a belief that he was entitled to dispose of anyone who inconvenienced him. He wasn't a monster who happened to be a doctor. He was a monster who used his medical knowledge as his weapon. In the bustling, high-achieving world of 1980s New York City, Dr. Robert Birnbaum was a man who had it all. He was a handsome and brilliant surgical resident at a prestigious hospital, a certified genius who could speak 5 languages, an expert skier, and even a licensed pilot. He lived in a fancy apartment on the Upper East Side with his wife, Gail Katz Birnbaum, an intelligent and beautiful psychology graduate student. To anyone looking in, they were a power couple living a life of immense promise and privilege. But behind the sophisticated facade, their marriage was a pressure cooker of control, violence, and fear. And it was about to explode. The dark truth was that Dr. Birnbaum was a deeply disturbed and violent man. He was pathologically jealous and possessive of Gail, and his rage could ignite without warning. Friends and family later testified to a horrifying pattern of abuse. In one instance, enraged that Gail's cat had scratched him, he took the animal to the bathroom and tried to drown it in the toilet. In another, far more terrifying incident, he caught Gail smoking a cigarette on their apartment balcony. Flying into a rage, he attacked her from behind, wrapped his hands around her throat, and choked her into unconsciousness. He later admitted to this act during a session with Gail's psychiatrist, but chillingly, he expressed no remorse. By the summer of 1985, Gail had had enough. She was having an affair and had told her closest friends that she was finally ready to leave her abusive husband. More than that, she intended to expose his violent behavior to the hospital's review board, an act that would have torpedoed his promising medical career. Robert Birnbaum was about to lose control, and for a narcissist like him, that was unacceptable. His wife had become a threat, and he decided to eliminate her. On July 7, 1985, Gail Katz Birnbaum disappeared. When police questioned him, Robert's story was calm and unnervingly practiced. He claimed they had a minor argument. She stormed out of the apartment to go sunbathe in Central Park and simply never returned. But his behavior was full of red flags. He waited nearly 24 hours to report her missing and seemed strangely unconcerned. When speaking to police, he was evasive and provided a psychologist's letter written by himself, analyzing his wife's supposed fragile mental state, a clear attempt to control the narrative. The most damning piece of information, however, came from an airport in New Jersey. On the very day his wife vanished, Robert Birnbaum, an experienced pilot, rented a single-engine Cessna 172 aircraft. For nearly 2 hours, he flew the plane out over the vast, empty expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. His flight log was suspiciously vague, offering no purpose for the unusual and risky trip. Investigators immediately suspected the horrifying truth, but with no body, no murder weapon, and no crime scene, the case went cold. For the next 15 years, Dr. Birnbaum got away with murder. He left New York, finished his surgical residency, and built a new, prosperous life for himself. He established a thriving plastic surgery practice, first in Las Vegas and later in Minot, North Dakota. He remarried a fellow doctor, had a daughter, and once again became a respected pillar of his community. He was the president of his local synagogue, a celebrated gourmand featured in magazines, a man who had successfully buried his dark secret and started over. But the law had not forgotten Gale. In 1999, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office reopened the cold case, armed with new forensic perspectives and a team determined to bring Birnbaum to justice. They re-interviewed dozens of witnesses, painting a clear picture of Birnbaum's violent history and Gale's intent to leave him. They brought in aviation experts, who testified that his 1985 flight made no sense, concluding that the only logical purpose for flying a small plane so far out over the ocean was to dispose of something heavy. The prosecution constructed a powerful circumstantial case that on that July day, Birnbaum had killed Gale in their apartment, most likely by strangulation. Then, using his precise surgical skills, he dismembered her body, packed the remains into a flight bag, drove to the airport, and dumped his wife into the Atlantic from 2,000 feet. In October 2000, Robert Birnbaum was finally put on trial for murder. He remained arrogant and defiant, certain that without a body, the jury could never convict him. He was wrong. After hearing the overwhelming evidence of his motive and the suspicious flight, the jury found him guilty of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 20 years to life in prison. For 2 decades, he maintained his innocence. Then, in a parole hearing in December 2020, the 70-year-old doctor finally confessed. He admitted he had killed Gale in a rage, stating, "I went flying. I flew the airplane over the ocean, and I threw her body out of the airplane." As of August 2025, Robert Birnbaum remains incarcerated at the Otisville Correctional Facility in New York. While he is eligible for parole, his confession has made his release highly unlikely. His case is a chilling study in narcissistic rage, a story of a man who thought his brilliance would allow him to commit the perfect crime and simply fly away from his past. In the suburbs of Detroit, Michigan, Dr. Farid Fatah was regarded as one of the top cancer specialists in the state. He was the owner of a sprawling and successful practice, the Crittenton Cancer Center, and to his terrified patients, he was nothing short of a god. When they received the devastating diagnosis of cancer, they flocked to Dr. Fatah, seeing his confident demeanor and aggressive treatment plans as their last best hope for survival. He cultivated an image as a brilliant, life-saving oncologist. In reality, he was a monster running a fraudulent poison-for-profit scheme, a man who had discovered the most ghoulish business model imaginable. Dr. Fatah's criminal enterprise was as simple as it was evil. His goal was to bill insurance companies for the most expensive treatments possible, and the most lucrative treatments in medicine are for cancer. So, he gave people cancer. He would tell patients with benign, harmless tumors that they had aggressive, fast-growing malignancies. He would tell patients whose cancer was in remission that it had come back with a vengeance. And in his most soulless acts of fraud, he would look perfectly healthy people in the eye and tell them they were dying of a rare cancer that required immediate, aggressive chemotherapy. Once the fake diagnosis was delivered, he would begin the treatment. He subjected his victims to grueling, medically unnecessary rounds of chemotherapy. This toxic cocktail of drugs ravaged their healthy bodies, destroying their immune systems, causing their teeth to rot and their bones to weaken. All while Fatah billed Medicare and private insurance companies for every single drop. He administered endless infusions of expensive drugs they didn't need, racking up millions of dollars in fraudulent claims while his victims grew sicker and weaker, believing they were fighting for their lives. For years, his practice grew, and he became incredibly wealthy. The first crack in his evil empire appeared when a respected hematologist, Dr. So Mongle, was brought in to cover the practice while Fatah was on vacation. Reviewing the patient files, Dr. Mongle was horrified by the blatant medical malpractice he saw. He confronted Fatah's office manager, George Karadsheh, about one patient receiving dangerous chemotherapy for a benign tumor. Karadsheh's response was chilling. "The doctor knows what he's doing. "Don't touch the patient." Dr. Mongley quit on the spot and immediately blew the whistle, alerting state regulators. Around the same time, one of Foda's own nurses, Angela Swantek, could no longer ignore her growing suspicion. She saw patients being kept on chemotherapy for years, long after it was medically justifiable, and noticed Foda would fly into a rage if any of his staff dared to question a treatment plan. Trusting her conscience, she took her concerns to federal investigators. The end came swiftly. In August 2013, FBI agents raided Dr. Foda's opulent clinics, seizing records and shutting down the operation. As the news broke, a wave of horror washed over his thousands of patients. People who had spent years believing they were dying of cancer suddenly learned they had been healthy all along. Their bodies, however, were shattered. One victim, Robert Sobiere, had been told he had a rare blood cancer. After years of brutal chemo, he lost all of his teeth, and his body was permanently weakened, only to find out from investigators that he had never been sick at all. Faced with a mountain of evidence and the prospect of hundreds of his victims testifying against him at trial, Foda pleaded guilty in September 2014 to 13 counts of healthcare fraud, 2 counts of money laundering, and conspiracy. The scale of his crimes was staggering. He had submitted more than $220 million in fraudulent claims, had been paid over $91 million by Medicare alone, and had abused over 550 victims. During his sentencing hearing in July 2015, dozens of the people he poisoned were finally able to confront him. One victim, her body still weak from the treatments, looked at him and said, "You are a monster. You preyed on our fears and you poisoned us for money." Foda offered a brief weeping apology, but it rang hollow. The judge, calling his crimes huge, horrific, and unparalleled, sentenced him to 45 years in federal prison. As of August 2025, Farid Foda is incarcerated at the Federal Correctional Institution, Williamsburg, in South Carolina. His scheduled release date is May 23, 2050. His case stands as one of the most egregious betrayals in medical history. He didn't just fail to uphold his oath to do no harm. He built a business model around it. His particular brand of insanity was one of pure, unadulterated greed, weaponizing his patients' deepest fears to turn their suffering into his personal fortune. Michael Swango was the very definition of a golden boy. Handsome, intelligent, and a decorated former Marine, he graduated near the top of his class from Southern Illinois University School of Medicine. To his classmates and professors, he was destined for a brilliant career. But beneath the polished surface, Swango harbored a dark and chilling obsession. While other students studied medical texts, Swango meticulously filled scrapbooks with graphic photos of car crashes, grisly accidents, and violent disasters. It was a bizarre hobby that his peers dismissed as a macabre sense of humor. They didn't realize they were looking at the private collection of a budding psychopath who wasn't just fascinated by death, but was eager to cause it. His killing spree began in 1983 during his surgical internship at Ohio State University Medical Center. Almost immediately, the nurses on his floor noticed a terrifying coincidence. Seemingly stable patients on Swango's rotation would suddenly and inexplicably die. They began calling him 00 Swango, a grim play on James Bond's License to Kill. One patient would be recovering perfectly from an operation. Then Swango would pay them a visit, often with a cup of coffee or a snack. Moments later, the patient would suffer a violent seizure or stop breathing. Autopsies were often inconclusive. The nurses repeatedly voiced their suspicions to the hospital administration, but their concerns were dismissed. A promising young male doctor was seen as a valuable asset. The nurses were seen as hysterical. Although ASU declined to keep him on after his internship, they failed to file a formal report about the dozens of suspicious incidents, an act of negligence that would have deadly consequences. Unable to secure another residency, Swango took a job as an emergency medical technician in Quincy, Illinois. The pattern repeated. Paramedics noticed that whenever Swango was on duty, the number of deaths seemed to spike. Then, his colleagues started getting violently ill after eating food Swango had brought into the station. In October 1984, he was finally caught after lacing a pitcher of iced tea and a box of donuts with arsenic, sickening several of his co-workers. He was arrested, convicted of aggravated battery, and sentenced to 5 years in prison. Everyone believed his medical career was over for good. They were wrong. After serving just 2 years, Swango was released. A convicted poisoner, he was pathologically determined to practice medicine again. He began lying on applications, omitting his felony conviction, and shockingly, he found a system willing to let him back in. In 1991, he was accepted into a residency program at the University of South Dakota. The dean of the medical school, Dr. Robert Towley, knew about Swango's poisoning conviction but decided to give him a second chance, believing his crime was a one-time incident born from stress. It was a catastrophic error in judgment. Soon, patients at the hospital in Sioux Falls began dying mysteriously after being treated by Swango, including a patient who bled to death and a woman who died of a massive seizure. He was quietly forced to resign, but once again, with no negative report filed that would flag him to other institutions. Now a fugitive doctor, Swango continued to find work by lying and using forged documents. He landed a position at Stony Brook University Hospital on Long Island, New York. There, a patient named Baron Harris died in agony after Swango injected him with what he claimed was a sedative. The dean at Stony Brook, Dr. Jordan Cohen, was the first administrator to do what his predecessors had failed to do: a thorough background check. When he discovered Swango's criminal past, he immediately fired him and sent a warning to every medical school and teaching hospital in the country. With his options in the US exhausted, Swango fled the country. In 1994, he used forged credentials to secure a job at a remote mission hospital in Zimbabwe. There, his killing escalated. Local doctors were horrified as they watched his patients die one after another. He was eventually suspended, but before he could be prosecuted, he vanished. In June 1997, Swango attempted to re-enter the United States through Chicago's O'Hare Airport, en route to a new job he had secured in Saudi Arabia. Federal agents were waiting for him. He was arrested, not for murder, but on federal charges for defrauding the government by lying on his applications. While he was in custody, investigators from New York, Ohio, and Illinois began the painstaking work of building murder cases against him, exhuming bodies and finding traces of poisons and paralyzing drugs. The evidence was overwhelming. Facing the possibility of the death penalty, Swango finally confessed. In 2000, he pleaded guilty to murdering 3 patients in New York and 1 in Ohio. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences, without the possibility of parole. While he was only convicted of 4 murders, prosecutors and investigators believe the true number of his victims is closer to 60, which would make him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. As of August 2025, Dr. Michael Swango is designated as a high-security inmate at the ADXC Florence Supermax prison in Colorado. He is a man whose insanity was not just in his desire to kill, but in his chilling ability to repeatedly exploit a medical system that valued reputation over patient lives, allowing him to turn his license to heal into a license to kill. In the 1980s, as a wave of moral panic swept across America, one man stood at the forefront, positioning himself as the nation's leading protector of innocence. Dr. Thomas Radke, a psychiatrist from Illinois, was the founder and chairman of the National Coalition on Television Violence, or NCTV. He was a constant presence on television talk shows and in newspaper articles, an acclaimed expert who warned of the profound dangers lurking in popular culture. He testified in court cases and lobbied Congress, claiming that horror movies, rock music, and especially the fantasy game Dungeons & Dragons were gateways to Satanism, suicide, and murder. To millions of concerned parents, Dr. Radke was a trusted authority, a moral crusader fighting to save the soul of America's youth. But behind his righteous crusade was a secret life of corruption and predation that was more depraved than anything he described in his fantasies. While Dr. Radke was publicly condemning the imaginary evils of pop culture, he was privately running his psychiatric practice in Clarion, Pennsylvania, as his own personal fiefdom of abuse. He specifically targeted his most vulnerable patients, particularly women with histories of addiction, trauma, and emotional instability. His method was a classic predator's trap. He would first get his patients legally hooked on powerful, addictive benzodiazepines like Valium and Xanax, prescribing them far beyond any medical necessity. Once his patients were chemically dependent on him, with their judgment clouded and their lives revolving around their next prescription, he would make his move. He began to demand sexual favors in exchange for the drugs they were now addicted to. He turned his medical office into a revolving door of exploitation, trading prescriptions for sexual acts and transforming the women who had come to him for help into his personal stable of drug-addled victims. They were trapped. He was their doctor, their sole source for the drugs he had addicted them to, and a powerful public figure. They felt they had no one to turn to. His vile operation continued for years, hidden behind the veneer of his moral campaign. But eventually, one of his victims found the courage to go to the police and report the years of abuse she had endured. This set in motion a sting operation designed to expose Radiki's hypocrisy. State police sent a female undercover officer, posing as a new patient, into his clinic. The results were immediate and damning. The officer recorded Radiki offering her powerful prescriptions after a laughably brief consultation, and then quickly propositioning her, explicitly stating that he would trade the drugs for sex. Investigators now had him on tape. In 1992, the crusading Dr. Radiki was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including delivery of a controlled substance and running a corrupt organization. The media firestorm was immense. The man who had built his career condemning fantasy monsters was revealed to be a real one. At his trial, several of his former patients gave harrowing testimony, detailing how he used addiction as a weapon to control and abuse them. He was convicted and sentenced to a term of 11 to 22 years in state prison. But the story doesn't end there. After serving 11 years, Radki was released on parole in 2003. In a shocking failure of the system, he successfully battled to have his medical licenses reinstated in several states, including Pennsylvania and Illinois. He rebranded himself as an expert in addiction medicine, an irony so profound it's almost unbelievable. He opened new clinics and immediately fell back into his old patterns. By 2011, new allegations surfaced. Once again, Dr. Radki was accused of being a pill mill doctor, overprescribing massive quantities of opioids and trading drugs for sex with his vulnerable patients. Facing new criminal charges and the permanent loss of his licenses, he finally surrendered them for good in 2016 to avoid another prison term. As of August 2025, Thomas Radke is a free man, but he is a permanent disgrace, finally and forever barred from practicing medicine. His organization, the NCTV, has long been discredited as a pseudoscience fear-mongering group. Dr. Radke's insanity was one of absolute moral rot. He manufactured a public panic about fictional demons to build a platform of trust, all while he was the real monster, preying on the sick and the vulnerable. He screamed to the world about the dangers of make-believe, just to distract everyone from the real-world evil he was committing every single day. Thank you for watching our deep dive into these 10 doctors who twisted their sacred oath into a weapon. The stories are a brutal reminder that the most terrifying monsters are often the ones we are taught to trust the most. It leaves a chilling question: who is truly more dangerous? The patient with a diagnosed illness, or the doctor who is absolutely convinced their own madness is medicine? Let us know what you think in the comments below.